I'm Diana Wentworth, and I'm so excited to be with you. I'm the co-founder of the Inside Edge Foundation for Education. It's been a forum for thought leaders and all kinds of people who are activists in the world where they meet and greet and expand who they are. And we've been recording 1,500 of our past speakers. And we're going to take the very best of these and offer them on our YouTube channel. We're starting to post them weekly. So what you want to do is go to our YouTube channel and to subscribe to it, and you'll get all kinds of information about what we're offering. It's so thrilling to be offering this legacy to you now. It feels really good.
It's a rare opportunity to talk about some lesser known aspects of Van Gogh. Often when people hear about Van Gogh, they immediately think about a tortured life and so on. And there is a lot of truth in that. The other side of the story, and we could probably turn the projector on at some point, the other part of the story is that there is a lesser known part of Van Gogh, and that is the title of the book that we produced. It's called Van Gogh's Untold Journey, and it talks about lesser known aspects of his life that I think are very important. And Van Gogh's innate humanism is something that many people know very little about, and that has been recognized by people who have had the opportunity to read his letters. Today's topic will be on lesser known aspects of Van Gogh. Many people know very little about his family upbringing. They know very little about some of the passions that really drove him that weren't destructive. There were some very health-giving aspects to Van Gogh that many people don't know about. And there have been many myths that have been perpetrated as well. It's to our advantage, perhaps in one way, that there have been two fairly recent films produced on Van Gogh, one called Loving Vincent, which is an animated film. Many of you probably saw that. And then more recently, At Eternity's Gate, which is a very interesting film in its own way. And there are many things about the film that I very much like, and I find them very congruent with Van Gogh's letters. So the talk that I'm going to give you today is derived almost entirely from his letters and from people who knew him directly. There are many myths, as I said, that have been perpetrated. For instance, one that he sold only one painting in his lifetime. People say that all the time. It's absolutely not true. He sold two paintings at a major auction in Copenhagen, but he also was commissioned at different times of his life, at least twice, to produce art. There was a dentist in Holland who wanted a cycle of the four seasons, and Vincent painted that and was paid for that. And another commission came through his uncle, who was also an art dealer, who commissioned Vincent to do a series of drawings of Amsterdam, some of the monuments and major buildings in Amsterdam. These were pencil drawings, and Vincent did that. He was paid for that. But he also traded his work fairly extensively with known artists. Gauguin and Van Gogh exchanged work. Emile Bernard and Van Gogh exchanged work. So the lesser known aspect of Van Gogh sets the record straight in the sense that we go back to the documents and his actual life story, and we tell the story that way. Let me begin by showing you some portraits of Vincent, and I'll just ask you a quick question and see what your thought about it is, and this may help all of us to see some parts of Van Gogh that we may not have thought of before. As you look at these portraits, let me just have a show of hands. How many people think that the top portrait on the left was one of the last portraits he ever did? Just a show of hands. Okay. Yeah, how many people think it might be the top one on the right? Show of hands. Okay, how about the one dead center with the pipe and the ear, which is bandaged? How many of you think that would be the one? Okay. Would you be surprised to know that it's the second one from the right on the top, clean shaven, where he looks younger than he did at any other time? Yeah, surprising, isn't it? The reason for that is interesting. He was 35 years old at the time that this happened, and he had already started to experience some severe epileptic seizures. And his mother was very concerned about him. And she had just celebrated her 70th birthday, so he painted this picture and shipped it to her, looking a lot like a surfer, you know, nice, clean tan, his hair combed and so on. He wanted to reassure his mother that he was okay. It's something of a myth, but it shows that he cared very much about his mother. And that's a telling sign. People who love their parents, generally speaking, have a better way of loving other people. And Van Gogh did have a great admiration for both of his parents, although that's been mythologized too. And we'll talk about that at different points in the talk today. So let me just begin by showing you very quickly what some of the key themes are that we'll cover today. We'll talk very briefly about his sister-in-law, Joanna van Gogh Bonger, who really was the person who inherited all of his letters and all of his paintings after her husband, Theo, who was an art dealer, and Vincent's brother, had died. She is a remarkable woman, and very few people know about her. And hopefully, over the next few years, I may have an opportunity to co-author a new book on her. In fact, actually, it's in production and steady production over the last 6-7 years, and I hope to see the book emerge maybe in 2020. The family Van Gogh is a very interesting family, and it's a deep family. It goes back generations, including on his mother's side, the individuals who were actually commissioned to bind the Constitution of the Dutch Republic, which was a tremendous honor. And on the father's side, many different important clergymen, pastors, jewelers, and so on, prominent people. His uncle was the vice admiral of the Dutch Navy, and Vincent could go to Amsterdam and actually stay with his uncle on the port and see ships coming in and out. People have no idea that Van Gogh actually came from a family of some privilege and great honor within the Dutch Republic. And when he decided to step away from that for various reasons, he was something of a prodigal son. But he stepped away from something that was really very impressive in its own way. I'll talk briefly about the influence of Charles Dickens, which was huge in Van Gogh's life. And in other periods where I've had a longer period to talk, I spend more time on that, but we have more limited time today, so I'll just, in a way, touch on that. I'll talk about a central theme in Van Gogh's own passion, which is called Healing Themes in Domestic Dreams, which is the title of a chapter in our book. And this represents a desire that Van Gogh always had to have a family, which he never had. He wanted to have children, he wanted to have a wife. He really loved the idea of that, and it was denied him again and again. It was a constant theme of sadness that's reflected in his letters. Toward the end of his life, a key influence was the influence of Victor Hugo in the book Les Miserables, which he had read more than once in his life, but he had returned to it at the end of his life, and it had a huge impact on him. And one of the revelations of our book, and one of the reasons that it's done very well internationally, is that we lay out the influence of Les Miserables and the painting Starry Night, which derived, we believe, from that novel, where the title, The Starry Night, actually appears, and a description of what would have inspired Van Gogh emanates from that book as well. I will share that with you as well. And then Van Gogh and Paul Gauguin, I'll touch on that briefly at the end. It's a controversial subject, and one that deserves at least a look in passing. One of the first works that I saw when I was a student in Holland, I lived there and was I was exchange student in a Dutch academy. While I was in art school, was this drawing of Van Gogh called The Reaper, which he made in 1885. And it depicts a laborer, someone that probably worked in the town of Noonan. He was a field hand. And Van Gogh was very drawn to these peasants. He admired their ability to work, and he found that they were honest people. And there is even a certain type that's called the Brabanter in the town in the region of Brabant. And these people were known as very steadfast, hardworking, honest people. To be called a Brabanter was a very much of a salutation. It's sort of like our feeling about Uncle Abe, you know, Lincoln and the honest Abe notion. How honest he always was, can't say, but he certainly was someone who had that reputation. And Van Gogh was very much drawn to these people, and literally, and made some of his earliest strong drawings from them. And we don't see any of the swirling lines and so on that we attribute with his later work, because his early work was very much traditional. He was well trained, and he was doing mail order courses and learning to draw, and also studying with various people, including a cousin, Anton Mauve, who was a very well-known painter of animals, especially sheep, believe it or not. He was a great painter of sheep and also nautical subjects, so Vincent studied with him as well. Typically of Van Gogh, if he had had Facebook or something like that, he would have been posting images that he was working on. But in fact, what he did was he would always illustrate his letters. And his long-term desire, believe it or not, the early of his career, was to be an illustrator and illustrate books of Charles Dickens. Well, Charles Dickens died in 1870, and Vincent was only 17 years old or so at the time, so that wasn't likely that he would ever do that. But the first impulse that he had was to illustrate books. And that way, the notion of his being influenced by literature throughout his life was there. So when we talk about his being influenced by Les Miserables, that's not far-fetched at all, because throughout his life he was influenced by various literary sources and had hoped to illustrate them, which is one of the reasons why he's a popular artist, because he always had in mind telling some type of story in his work. Rembrandt did it too. Van Gogh and Rembrandt both had, and many other artists too, but Van Gogh had a very keen ability to give you the essentials. It was a saying that of his. He said the project of the artist is to emphasize the obvious and to de-emphasize that which is less important. And it sounds rhetorical and curious, but he had a very real ability to do that. Here he's showing Theo in a letter, a painting that he was working on. You can see his handwriting, and if you look at the drawing at the top of the work, there it is. There's a painting that he was working on. It was the Garden of Debuny in the town of Vauvert, where he was living toward the end of his life. So we have hundreds of letters like this going back and forth where we see Van Gogh literally describing, illustrating, talking about in words works that he was creating visually. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind, and it's a lesser-known fact about Van Gogh is that he had a very strong connection between the written word and the visual. He said there's no strong difference between what is said and what is portrayed if the artist is a true illustrator. And the word illustrator comes from the word illustra, to shed light on something, to provide light. And Van Gogh, I believe, that did that probably as well as many people did. We see him another letter here with his handwriting, very beautiful handwriting, by the way. It shows a very creative individual. Anyone who's done creative analysis of handwriting will recognize the way that he's breaking up words and so on, and a strong slant to his writing, which shows that he's a very determined, forward-looking person, all of which is true about him. He was a very good planner, very strategic in the things that he planned, and he often described in great detail things that he was doing. For instance, here's a letter he wrote in 1883, this was 7 years before he died, and we can see typically that Van Gogh had trained himself to be a very good writer. I'll just read the second paragraph of this. That coming home of the flock in twilight was the finale of the symphony I heard yesterday. That day passed like a dream. All day I was so absorbed in the poignant music. He's talking about the clouds and the whole feeling of being in a field and hearing the birds and experiencing just the beauty of nature that was surrounding him, that I literally forgot even food and drink. I had taken a piece of brown bread and a cup of coffee in the little inn where I drew the spinning wheel. The day was over, and from dawn till twilight, or rather from one night till the other, I had lost myself in that symphony. Comparing the experience of nature to a symphony is a very interesting notion, and there are times where I think we all do experience that. Nature can be so rich and so poignant, but this reveals a person who is extremely moved by nature, and that's very typical of him. He was a man who had very deep feelings. He could be easily hurt, and there were times where he would defend a cause to the degree that it could end a friendship, because he felt that issues were very important, and two friendships could even endure a disagreement. Picasso felt that too, by the way, and had an ability to end more than one friendship over issues like that. Here's a photograph of Vincent's sister-in-law, Joanna. She's holding a little boy who's named Vincent Willem van Gogh, exactly named after Vincent, her brother-in-law. And there was a reason for this. Van Gogh, at the time that this was painted in 1889, just a few months before his death, Both Joanna and Theo knew that Vincent would probably have lifelong health issues because these grand mal seizures that he was having seemed to now be accompanied by some kind of neurological breakdown. His hands were shaking. He found it more and more difficult to draw. And he felt that his purpose in life, which he felt had been to be an artist, was slowly eroding. And they were very concerned about that. And they thought one of the things that would cheer him up would be to have a child named after him, which they did in a very extraordinary way. So the beauty of this devotion that both Joanna and Theo felt for Vincent is something that's virtually untold in the journey about Van Gogh. And to give us just a sense of who these people were who were standing behind Vincent, prominently it would be his brother and Joanna. These are wedding pictures taken of them. And if you look at the birth and death dates, you'll see that Joanna lived to 1925, and unfortunately her husband died in 1891, only after about 1.5 years of marriage. Yeah, very short, yeah. They had dated for about 4 or 5 years, and we have a trove of love letters between them. It's very touching. And that's part of what we're working on when we do this new book. We want people to know more about this side of Joanna and Theo. Here is a reference that Joanna made in her own diary after her husband died in 1892. This is a year after he died. She had a drawer full of all the letters that were exchanged between Vincent and her brother, and her husband rather. And so there were probably 400 or 500 letters that she had in that drawer. And over the last many years, over the last century or so, we've acquired many others. So we have over 702 known letters. But he wrote sometimes 2 or 3 letters a day. Van Gogh was a very avid letter writer, which he modeled after his mother, who was a pastor's wife. And a pastor's wife has the job of often consoling and often comfort and consolation to people. And Van Gogh saw that as a calling. He saw letter writing as a real important thing. Listen to the way that she describes her relationship with her husband posthumously and Vincent, who had also died, both of them gone. In thought, I'm living wholly with Theo and Vincent. Oh, that infinitely delicate, tender, and lovely quality of that relation, how they felt for each other, how they understood each other, and oh, how touching Vincent's dependence at times. Theo never let him feel it, but now and then he feels it himself, and then his letters are very sad. Often I wept over them. My darling, my dear, dear Theo, at every word between every 2 lines, I'm thinking of you, how you made me part of yourself in the short time we were together. I'm still living with you and by you. May your spirit go on inspiring me, then everything will be all right with our little fellow. Who will write that book about Vincent? It's a very interesting question, and when we started our book, we wanted to be very authentic. We wanted to be very much true to the letters, and we were hoping that maybe we were offering one of the books that was true. And I think there's no question that both Joanna and Theo had discussed the possibility of a book being written on Vincent at some point, because they felt that letters were so powerful, so extraordinary, that they warrant publication and international acceptance, which did happen. And I'll touch on that briefly. We see a photograph here, which we discovered recently. This was a relatively unknown photograph. Fortunately, we have an archivist in the town of Noonan, where Van Gogh lived in his teens and so on, who has been able to unearth some interesting pictures that haven't been lesser known, and some maybe never reproduced before. So we see Joanna here on the left. We see Vincent's mother in the middle, and we see Vincent's nephew named after him on the right. Photograph probably taken around 1902, judging from the ages. And Vincent's mother lived on to be 87 years old. She outlived her husband and Vincent by over 50 years. So she's one of the few people who was very close to Joanna at the end of their life. And if you look closely, there's something unusual about this picture for the type of rather staid picture so typical of the time. You'll see that Joanna has her arms wrapped around and interlaced with her mother-in-law in a very tender way. And the two had a very strong affection for each other. So that tells us a lot about the cohesion of the family and Joanna's sort of passion to keep the family together. if you will. Here's a painting that Vincent did of his mother. We can see her birth and death date. She dies in 1907, and her husband died in 1885. He was only in his 50s, died of a massive heart attack. He was a pastor of a small church and a very hardworking gentleman. In fact, it was the ethos of the Van Gogh clan to take the maximum out of oneself. They viewed each other and themselves as a mine, something like a gold mine. And the idea is to extract as much out of yourself as you can by the end of a life, and that you owe it to your fellow man to do so. So there's a very strong moral quality that was a work ethic, surely. He was a pastor to the poor. He was a welfare evangelist, and he did not stay with any particular religious boundary in the sense of offering care packages, food, clothing to people who had suffered famine, fires, and so on. And so Vincent grew up with this notion of we would say, a very open understanding of Christianity as being non-sectarian and focusing entirely on the notion of loving one's neighbor. Van Gogh said that the essence of the gospel is love thy neighbor as thyself, and love God in that way, by showing love to others. And he believed that all of his life, even when he went through his severe stages and so on. He always held to that. He said, I will always hold to that universal value of loving one others as one loves oneself, and to be generous. He was a very generous person, by the way, and he gave away a great deal of artwork as well. His mother was a very bright, hardworking woman as well, and there's a quality of that in this painting of Vincent that comes through with this green background and a very piercing eyes and so on. It was said that she could knit with such speed that it was almost like watching magic, because the needles would move so fast. So from her also he got a desire and a love of painting watercolors, which she was very good at as well. When Vincent's father died in 1885, Van Gogh had another 5 years to live, and he really regretted the fact that he had never painted his father. He hadn't developed enough as a portrait painter in order to do that. But in 1888, while he was living in the town of Arles in southern France, he met a peasant who bore a striking resemblance to his father, and this has not been documented very much. He said this gentleman walked in while he was in the cafe having breakfast, and Vincent almost fell off his chair. He said it was like seeing Dad walking around in a peasant's clothing. He said the slope of his shoulders and all of that was there. And Van Gogh began to paint this gentleman. He was paying him essentially a laborer's wage of what he would earn in a field, picking fruits and things of that nature. So Vincent painted him a number of times, and the paintings are very tender. He said, I wanted to paint as though I were painting Christians at the very beginning, before there were all kinds of sects, the primitive ones who would meet in their houses and so on, who would share common meals. He said, this is the kind of individual I want to paint, but I want to find people in my community who remind me of those kinds of honest people who would share their food and clothing and so on. And so he said, I'm going to surround this gentleman with gold light, and instead of giving him a halo, I'll give him an illuminated hat. And he referred to that as natural supernaturalism, using natural means to communicate something spiritual. And there's this grounding of the spiritual in the physical that is the essence of Van Gogh. In fact, he referred to that as the resurrection principle, coming from a religious background. He also studied to be a pastor, by the way, and hoped to be one, and we'll touch on that briefly. And that's very important to understand about his work. People will find an unusual spirituality in his work because it's there. He definitely wanted to illustrate the idea that there was another realm that we do not see, but we see it through the known. We see the unknown through the known, and that's the notion of the incarnation, the Word made flesh. And so Van Gogh felt that painting itself was incarnational. And he mentioned this a number of times, that the work of the artist is to take their spirit and give matter, charge matter with significance, which is essentially what is meant by the resurrection, which we've just celebrated, Christians have just celebrated here at Easter. Now, the image that we use in the front cover of our book was actually a tribute drawing that Toulouse-Lautrec made of Van Gogh in 1886-87, when Van Gogh was living in Paris, and we see Toulouse-Lautrec there. and he passed away in 1901. And interestingly enough, at the end of his life, he had some of the same symptoms that Vincent was suffering from. He began to have blackouts, he began to have neurological difficulties, and so on. And we now know that both Van Gogh and Lautrec were drinking huge amounts of absinthe during this time that they were together. And it was unregulated, often made of very poor quality, sometimes alcohol. It might have even been something like rubbing alcohol. And those issues came up during that period in America where we made alcohol illegal. So unfortunately, there was a great deal of abuse of that. And so unfortunately, these gentlemen drank a lot of very bad stuff that did apparently affect them. And there are psychologists and others who have studied these symptoms. And unfortunately, it seems to have affected Vincent. It was a little late for him to fully recover from it. A photograph was discovered in the 1990s. That's the one on the left. Many people believe that it's an authentic photograph of Van Gogh, but there's reasons to question it. I'm not going to say for sure it is. I have my own beliefs and doubts about it, but what's interesting is that when you reverse the painting and you start lining it up with the photograph, and when you impose the painting on top of the image, there's some amazing congruencies. And two clinical pathologists have studied these the painting and the drawing and the photographs rather, and they're pretty well convinced that it's an authentic photograph. But if it is that it's the only known adult photograph we have of Van Gogh, the earliest, the latest one we have, he was around 18 when it was made, but we don't have an adult photograph of him. And this sort of supplies at least the image. If it is an authentic, it gives us a very good idea of what he really did look like at that age with the receding hairline and the whole thing. The portrait of his mother, if you take a moment and look at this, you'll see how it is that he might have reversed the photograph, because the painting of his mother actually began with that photograph at the bottom right. He then traced the photograph on a large sheet of paper and then reversed it. For some reason, he didn't like the fact that she was looking that direction. He completely flipped it. And as you look through the bottom, through the top section where we see the colors and so on, you begin to see how he altered the photograph in a lot of ways. He took the brooch away, he added things to the hat, he made her smile a bit more, and so on. But the green in the background is telling, because his mother was a floral gardener, so was his father, and he wanted to suggest some of that intimacy that they had with flowers and the enjoyment that they had. And Van Gogh had a lifelong love of flowers as well that came through. His connection with Dickens was very profound. You may or may not know that Dickens, in addition to being a very important author, was very much involved in welfare activities through the sale of his books. He set up numerous homes to rehabilitate women who had been involved in prostitution, a theme also in Les Miserables. He also was very much involved in humane societies for animals and also orphanages, and gave a lot of his money to these causes. He was something of an activist. He wanted people to be paid decent wages and was very much opposed to children being used in the labor force. And Queen Victoria was very impressed by his own advocacy, and it helped do a lot to reform things. Van Gogh had hoped, through his reading of Dickens' work, to become an illustrator for Dickens, and when he couldn't, he decided to use his own artwork in different ways to speak to the cause of the poor and the dispossessed. When Dickens died in 1870, Van Gogh was very moved by it. He said, "Who's going to fill his empty chair?" And he meant his moral chair. In 1888, he painted his own chair. And I think the question is really kind of answered in a way. He himself wanted to be among those people who were rehabilitating and carrying the mantle for the poor, the dispossessed, the ignored. And that was really his mission at the end of his life. He had a tremendous advocacy for others. This was one of the most popular illustrations of the Victorian era. It's called Applicants for the Admission to a Casual Ward, and it shows poor people literally standing on the streets of London in the snow without shoes and so on. We see this little girl up against the wall, her father's holding her. She has no shoes on, We see a family, a woman in the foreground with her daughter. They're nicely bundled up, and they're cold, and they're heading home from someplace. And the casual ward was a lottery. You get a ticket to go in and sleep on a bed with a warm fire. And if you didn't get a ticket, you stayed out all night on the street. And many people died of freezing in London. And it was this painting, along with Dickens' writing and many others, that started to cause more and more homes for the destitute and so on to be created. We have those issues right now, as you know, in our country, big time. California's dealing with those questions big time. It's nothing new, but one of the very first works that Van Gogh created as a watercolorist was this state lottery office, the same thing. These are people who are getting soup at a soup kitchen. And Van Gogh did many of his early works having to do with the themes of the poor and the destitute receiving some kind of health care and so on. So this heart of human concern is really at the core of Van Gogh, and it came from the fact that he came from a welfare background. His father, welfare evangelist. Vincent went on many times with his father and grandfather. His grandfather also was a welfare evangelist, two of them. So he was raised in this environment. And with the Van Gogh ethos, the notion was to serve others, to be of service. And when he felt toward the end of his life that he was no longer able to draw and so on, he felt that his service and ability to serve humankind was diminished significantly. And I think the thought of suicide did occur to him then. But he had mixed feelings about suicide. He felt that it was morally wrong to take one's life. And so there's open questions even today about whether or not Van Gogh may have been accidentally shot. In the film most recently, At Eternity's Gate, the theory is purported there. And it's been purported, believe it or not, it was purported already in the 1930s by John Rewald, who is a very important art historian who went to the town of Auvers and interviewed people who had actually been there during the shooting and so on, who said categorically that he was accidentally shot by some young boys. And so Rewald already thought that years ago, before it became sort of resurrected the idea that this might have happened. Just in the last 10 years, it came to the foreground again, especially with films and so on. Here's another even earlier drawing called The Miner's Return. It's a very amateurish drawing, and he made this just a year or two after working in coal mines as a nurse evangelist. Van Gogh's training as a welfare evangelist included nursing training. And he was pretty well trained. He knew how to dress a wound. He knew what to do if someone was severely burnt and so on. And so these early drawings of him show a tremendous concern for the poor. These are often women who are working in mines, carrying home bags of coal, they lived a very rugged life. There were also children working in these mines that Vincent was very worried about. So he did this for about 2.5 years, as I recall. And at the end of it, he was fired by a missionary group that had hired him. And he was very angry at these people who fired him, feeling that their red tape got in the way for their concern for others. Van Gogh was actually nursing people who had been involved in a fire-damped explosion in the mine. And the zealots who were in charge of this, we would say, legalistic kind of religious group, put his appearance and all of that ahead of all of that. And so we see a little more of that kind of concern. So we'll see that eventually when he paints a picture like the Potato Eaters in 1885, when he was really coming on his own, he put together works that really spoke to these people. And his concern with these individuals who have to live a very meager, difficult life produced work that we wouldn't consider necessarily beautiful. I mean, how many of you would like to have a painting of potatoes on your wall? I mean, be honest. Or Potato Eaters is a pretty dark painting. Let's be honest about it. But what comes through is a humanity. And this is the heart of Van Gogh's work. In fact, Vincent thought to the end of his life that this painting, The Potato Eaters, was his greatest work, even more so than the brightest pictures that he ever painted, because the heart of concern and love of others is there. In fact, a very famous saying of Vincent was, "I would never understand love that was not an action." And that's a very important quote. Even when he paints a pair of shoes, it reflects the laborer. He surrounds them with this gold light that he uses around the Bible. He sees that same compassion coming through. So these are lesser known aspects of Van Gogh that most people don't know about. So I'm going to have to move ahead. I've got 10 minutes, I see. And for about a year and a half, he took up residence with a woman who was carrying a child. He took care of her after she gave birth and wanted to adopt the child and marry her. And she unfortunately deserted. But during that year and a half, he was able to really hone his drawing skills because he had people to draw all the time. But he always associated flowers with love. And it's interesting, after the breaking up with this woman and so on, he went to Paris, stayed with his brother, and spent 2 years painting flowers primarily to free himself, to give himself a full range of color. He said, what's a better way of learning to handle color than painting bouquets? So we get to an important influence here toward the end of his life. The last 2 years of his life, he was very obsessed with painting works that he felt were timeless. He was reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. In chapter 2, I believe, of that book, he reads this. And if you look up 4 lines from the bottom, you'll see the title of the book here. When the flowers of night inhale their perfume, lighted up like a lamp in the center of the starry night. And it begins by a description of the spectacles, the starry firmament, and the adoration, the serenity of the skies, and it's depicting a bishop who, at the end of the day, would go out in his garden and dialogue with, we would say, with God. And here we have the Starry Night of Van Gogh, which he titled The Starry Night. And as I've said, he was reading Les Miserables at the time and made several references to this bishop. So it's a work that is very important. And it includes stars that look very much like flowers. When you go forward and backward and look at a star like the one on the right, you immediately realize that it looks very much like the flowers he was painting. And so many of the themes of the Starry Night occur also in works that he was doing right up to the end of his life in 1890, just months before he died. They're all directly taken from the Gospel, the parables of Jesus, the Good Samaritan, and the raising of Lazarus after Rembrandt. He was finding reproductions and etchings by great artists and painting color versions of them, all on religious themes. So at the end of his life, he had really returned to his Dutch Reformed background and painted picture after picture that have this natural supernaturalism, including this work just behind us showing a reaper, but instead of giving him a halo, he uses the full moon. So Van Gogh always found a very amazing way of telling these kinds of stories, that even his great landscapes flooded with a kind of gold light that he really associated with creation. He really felt that this was created by a divine being. He always believed that. And so this sort of spiritual quality comes through all of his work, which I think is one of the reasons why when I was in the Van Gogh Museum years ago, and I've been there many times on a Sunday, it had the same feeling of being in a religious service. People were very quiet, very respectful, going from work to work, and very deeply moved. And I know why, because there's an intended spiritual quality in Van Gogh's work that he always wanted to be there. And so I'm just going to end here. Van Gogh and Gauguin did try to develop a friendship. It lasted only a couple of months. Gauguin and Van Gogh had very serious disagreements. Gauguin was known as something of a schemer and self-promoter, which Vincent wasn't. And so they had a breakdown in their friendship over a variety of different issues. And Gauguin himself went through a lot of very serious changes and questions toward the end of his own life. And he painted a self-portrait called Self-Portrait Near Golgotha in 1896, a religious title, a religious theme, alluding to his own upbringing as a Roman Catholic, having studied in basically a boys' seminary. And he was quite knowledgeable about Scripture. And so his work often has very overt religious imagery in it, which many people don't recognize, but he and Van Gogh did share an interest in trying to bring a type of non-sectarian religiosity or spirituality into their work, and often using religious themes to do it without necessarily alluding to any particular sect. And here we have a great work of Gauguin painted between 1897 and 1898, and I equal it to Van Gogh's Starry Night. It's a painting called Where Do We Come From? Who Are We? Where Are We Going? And it asks the big questions about life and eternal life, which Gauguin was dealing with because he was dying of a combination of diseases, which took him out in 1903. And he thought this would be his last painting of his life. Vincent's death, suicide, or accident, it could have been either way. I'm drawn to both sides of the argument. I do think there's enough evidence to believe he may have been accidentally shot, but I also think that it's very possible he took his own life. In the end, I'm not going to say does it matter. It does matter, I suppose. But I do like the idea that he might have been accidentally shot, not because it's good, but because at least 2 or 3 times in his life he took the blame for other people. That's documented. And if these boys had accidentally shot him and he thought they were going to be in serious trouble, it would have been in Vincent's nature to have not implicated them. In fact, when he was interviewed while he was dying about the gunshot, he said, "I've been shot, but don't look for anybody else," which is a very strange thing to say, actually. So we have 5 minutes. Okay, I could say a little bit more about that, or we could open up to questions now, either way. I saw some hands practically going up, so why don't we do that? As they're getting the mic up, I'll share with you two very important paintings of Van Gogh. People don't realize that he began to do his sunflower paintings in 1887 before the iconic ones that we know well, like the one on the left here from 1888. And these were cast-off flowers he was finding in the gutters and so on. And I love the idea of rehabilitation, which is so much the theme. He took something that was thrown away and created a gorgeous painting out of it, like the one on the right. But when he had an opportunity to really elevate them, they're on the left. And I think it's very consistent with what Van Gogh said. I would never recognize love that was not an action. And you'll find that that really is one of the themes of the book that we've produced. And it's based really on his letters. And I do hope you'll consider the book, and I'll tell you one reason. We support the Endangered Children's Foundation, which is rehabilitating children who have been trafficked and victimized. All the net profits from the book go to the Endangered Children's Foundation. We have a booklet on the Endangered Children's Foundation up here for you to look at if you're interested. But we hope if you do buy the book, you'll know that you're actually making a donation to an extraordinary organization that's saving the lives of children, which is something that Van Gogh, I believe, would have wanted. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate your work. It's absolutely incredible. I'm a lover of Van Gogh and his work as well.
Thank you.
And I was wondering, he was this incredible humanist. Do you think that he had any severe psychological issues? I do know the story about his mother having had a child a year previously, and
That's
on
right.
his exact birth date.
That's right.
And some of those things, can you speak to his psychological
Sure.
health, please?
I mean, I can't speak authoritative about anybody's psychological health, but I can tell you the known fact. You said it. Many people don't realize that Van Gogh was born on exactly the same day that a stillborn brother had been born a year earlier. Exactly. Wow. And so he saw the grave of this little boy all of his life. We know that individuals who have had a brother, Elvis Presley had a brother, by the way, he was a twin who died, and Charles Dickens also did. People who have had a sibling die often feel somehow responsible for the death of that person. And they carry with them a sense of guilt about being alive. Often people who have been in combat and have seen fellow soldiers die have that too. So yes, I believe that did affect him in certain ways. He felt in a way he needed to atone for his own existence. There's truth in that. He went through periods of depression, but he would pull himself out of it very much so. The most severe problem really happens in the end of his life, the last 16 months when he began using the absinthe. This is where things really started to crash. He began to have hallucination and other things that would accompany these grand mal seizures, and then he would have to work through that. When he got completely off of the sauce, so to speak, and was eating a healthier diet, he was doing really quite well. And the person who really got him off the wagon was Gauguin. Gauguin showed up at Arles and got Vincent drinking absinthe again, and it started to just plummet him. And interestingly enough, 2 months after the time that Gauguin came, Vincent's issue with the ear happened, and then et cetera. So hanging out with people who are heavy drinkers, if you are trying to deal with that, is not a good thing. We all know that. And so Vincent succumbed to that. Yeah. Is that at least a part of an answer? I hope so. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So did he grow up in a big city, small village, and what was his early education like? And are there stories about when he started drawing? I mean, was it very young?
Yeah, he did. He grew up in very small villages, Tilburg, which we've been to. He went to high school. We have friends we've been to Tilburg. Noonan is also a very small village. He was there as a teenager into his 20s and 30s. He would spend sometimes summers with his uncle in Amsterdam, but he didn't feel real comfortable in the big city. He was really very drawn to the rural communities and felt most comfortable. His early drawings are actually amazing. His mother encouraged him to draw and kept them. We've got early drawings of Vincent that show tremendous talent. And his mother encouraged that as well. So what was his education like? He had a very good education. He was a voracious reader. It's been said that he was probably the best read artist of the 19th century. One historian cited all the books that he read. She said he may have, in fact, been one of the best read artists of all time. And he had a great memory. He read all of Dickens' books, had all of Shakespeare. He read very widely, geography, sociology, very philosophical, a brilliant man. And the letters, if you have them, and one of the things that we wanted to do with our book was to give our readers full letters, which we do, more than other people who've written books, and I'm not boasting, it's just a fact. His letters are so beautiful that they need to be read entirely. So we give the reader full letters, and then we place them in the context and explain just what was really going on. And I think that's one of the reasons the book is done well, along with really good reproductions. Yes, ma'am?
I have an unusual question. The white paint that they used was made with lead.
Yes.
Was that also something that may have affected him?
Yes, that's a
and the
theory.
artist?
That's very true. That's a theory also. Van Gogh was reusing lead white, and it wasn't known that this was so dangerous and so on. And he didn't always wash his hands while he was painting. So he could have absorbed lead, no doubt about it. There were a number of things going on. We also know that, like many people in the 19th century, he had also contracted syphilis. Yeah. And so that's not a good thing. And so the combination of all of these things, he had a sympathy for prostitutes. He tried to rehabilitate one. Unfortunately, that didn't work out so well for him in the long run. Yes, ma'am.
When did you know that you were going to write this book? What was your evolution?
Yeah, it's a good question. It really started, I would say, probably around 1966, and I wasn't even 20 years old at the time. And we had a Dutch lecturer at the art school that I was studying, Minneapolis College of Art and Design, who talked about Van Gogh's letters and wanted to do a book on them. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what's up. And so I started looking into him, but this gentleman never did the book. And it wasn't as though I tracked it, but by the time I got to a doctoral program, I knew very well that Van Gogh could make a very interesting doctoral study, and I got a lot of interest at Claremont Graduate University, where I did my Ph.D. People from the religion department and the art history department, all of that, really liked the idea. I remember one of my mentors went like this. He said, that's such a gritty subject. He really liked it because he knew there would be a lot of documents and others, rather than some, philosophical thing that's floating around in the air. It'd be well rooted in real life. And so they liked it at Claremont, and I got a wonderful glowing reference just from the new vice president of the college on LinkedIn. She wrote a wonderful thing about it because she ended up on my committee as well. She looks like she could be the president at Claremont one day. Patricia Easton, great lady. Other questions? Way in the back.
One more.
Will you talk to us more about the year?
Yeah, the year is a mystery, I'll tell you my theory, Havlicek's theory of the year. He was having his first breakdown. The first recorded breakdown is the air incident. He might have been shaving. It was cut with a straight razor. It's the top part of the ear, not the whole ear. That's possible. Gauguin, who was a fabricator, we know that because we have a lot of known incidents where he created stories that made him look like the key actor. We've had some people recently do this in our country, actors who wanted another role, maybe, I don't know. So he made this unbelievable story up about Van Gogh, and Van Gogh read it. He lived long enough to read it. He said, this is unbelievable. He said, none of this happened. none of this happened. Gauguin claimed that Van Gogh had cut his ear and then he collapsed and he fell asleep. And Gauguin said, I quietly left. I didn't want to bug him. And Vincent said, it was absolutely the opposite. I was screaming to him to stay with me and to not involve my brother, Theo, who had a heart issue. He said, I didn't want Theo to be worried about this. And Gauguin left anyway. He said, everything you said is absolutely untrue. He said that with the greatest care, I left him sleeping and thought it would be best not to awaken him, etc. It's just very, very curious. So when we hear a lot of the myth that has come out of the Van Gogh story, some of it came from Gauguin and his ability to spin a tale. And he produced his own biography while he was alive. People who do biographies while they're around, you often wonder about that, you know. So, good question.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much.